When adult survivors of family scapegoating abuse are chronically traumatized in their family of origin, they can develop something known as structural dissociation, which can be related to complex trauma. And that's what I'll be talking about in today's episode of Beyond Family Scapegoating Abuse, so stick around. In last week's video, I spoke about the 6 clinical consequences that I consider significant when I am first assessing someone new to my private practice. And they may or may not, such clients may or may not know that they are in the family scapegoat role. Some are very aware of that, and others actually have no idea. And one of the most severe clinical consequences of being scapegoated by one's family can be complex trauma. And complex trauma can be accompanied by structural dissociation, particularly if the scapegoating happened from a very early age or being treated in a non-nurturing, abusive manner, even if you're not specifically in the family scapegoat role. So early trauma, early childhood trauma that can begin as early as infancy, and some people in the transpersonal fields believe it can even happen in utero. And I'll talk more about that later since I am transpersonally oriented. But for today, I'm going to be talking about early childhood trauma that will show up in my practice as complex trauma symptoms and structural dissociation symptoms. As I discussed in my book, Rejected, Shamed, and Blamed, the chapter on the false self, and as I've also gone over in many of my articles on my blog, scapegoatrecovery.com/blog, when a child is being maltreated by their caregivers, typically the parents, it is too threatening to see the people taking care of you as not doing a good job of it. It is not possible for the child to be able to grasp the fact that they may be being treated in unjust, harmful, or scary ways. And I'm talking at very early childhood. To be able to even have the language, the words to describe it to oneself, much less to someone else. And especially if it's very early trauma, which can be pre-verbal, there's simply no way for the child to grasp the position that they're in, that the big people taking care of them may not like them, or may not want them, or may actively hate them. And yes, this can indeed happen, although that's hard for people to hear. And people from healthy families can't grasp that one very well at all, but it happens. So instead of the child being able to hold within their psyche such huge feelings as rage for the way they're being mistreated or abused, the safer thing to do is to turn it on the self. Because if you express the rage toward the caregiver, even worse things can happen to you. And again, a young child, it's a more primitive psyche, and it would be very unlikely that rage would come out directly, although it could show up in behaviors that could further the scapegoating of the child, or even begin the scapegoating of the child, because young children will exhibit rage in a variety of ways, including acting out, in not paying attention-seeking behaviors, depression. Children can have very, very big feelings, but they don't have the big multisyllable words to be able to express those feelings. And it would be a very unsafe thing to express these feelings to the people who are feeding you and giving you shelter and some sense of family and a home. This act of turning the rage inward is how the survival self begins to develop. And not just rage, but any of the authentic feelings, the true self nature, so to speak, that perhaps the family or the caregivers, the parents have shown the child are unacceptable in this family system. Those will be suppressed, repressed, pushed down, and the child will develop a survival self. And in my book, I call that the false self. Many of us do call it the false self or the survival self. And that's how the child may go through life unless they wake up to the fact that they're from a highly dysfunctional, abusive, or narcissistic family system, and they have not been living as their true self for most of their life. And even more than that, they may be living from a traumatized self that has fractured into parts. And that is what we call structural dissociation. Structural dissociation is not the same thing as dissociative identity disorder, much like narcissism and many of the things we talk about in psychology. The dissociation exists on a continuum. So we may have mild dissociation here, and we may have dissociative identity disorder here, and everything in between. And structural dissociation is one of those things that exists in the in-between on this continuum. Now, it's important to remember that these non-integrated, split-off parts are actually helping that child to survive. So we don't want to see these as something that's bad, that these survival parts exist, because if you start relating to some of the things I'm going to be teaching you about structural dissociation and survival parts, you might quickly realize that had you not behaved in certain ways, that the survival parts that maybe went into the fawn submit response, which might have kept you from getting beaten or into deep trouble or something worse. These parts helped you survive. These trauma responses helped you survive, especially if you have a lot of aggressive activity going on in your family of origin. That fawn submit part that may be tedious and not working so well for you today is maybe why you're here now. And that's just something that needs to be acknowledged, even celebrated. I invite my clients to thank their survival parts, and that it's okay for them to have those survival parts still until the personality becomes more integrated and they have more awareness and more choices in how they're going to respond to their environment and to how people are treating them. I'm going to read you a list of symptoms right now that will help me identify whether one of my clients may be experiencing structural dissociation. And I owe a great debt to Janina Fisher, PhD, whose workbook I use. I had mentioned that in previous videos, Transforming the Living Legacy of Trauma. And she has a chapter toward the end on structural dissociation. And so this is another reason it's such a great workbook to bring in to a therapist, or ask your therapist if they're willing to work with you on that. Or when you're looking for someone, finding a trauma-informed therapist who's open possibly to using Janina's workbook. So these symptoms I put together through various sources, including myself, but I would say my primary source is the work of Janina Fisher. So these are the symptoms that clue me in that there may be structural dissociation going on with my client. And I'll be talking next week, in fact, about treatments for structural dissociation that a trauma-informed therapist who knows of it and knows of this treatment can help people suffering from complex trauma and the symptoms of structural dissociation with. So I hope you subscribe if you haven't already, because that's what I'll be talking about next week. So here's the first symptom of structural dissociation: feeling chronically numb and emotionally detached. The next one is compartmentalizing information, frequently losing or misplacing things, finding yourself somewhere with no idea of how you got there, operating from two or more streams of consciousness, for example, showing up in therapy as distinctly different people from week to week, lack of motivation and stamina. You might leave tasks uncompleted. You might self-sabotage despite your best intentions to get something done. It doesn't get done, or it gets half done, and you're not even sure why that's happening. It can be very confusing, especially if you care about what you're doing. Feeling confused about your identity. A client might say to me, I just don't know who I am. Or how could I be 65 years old and still have no idea who I am? Doing things they have no memory of doing later. Zoning out, escaping via addictive behaviors, self-destructive behaviors, just not being able to be present with oneself and needing to escape, which could be associated, when we relate it to complex trauma, with the trauma response of flight. Isolating from others and what we call counter-dependency. Counter-dependency is where you lack trust in others, you fear trusting, and it can look like paranoia, but it is an understandable response to having your family of origin, your parents, your primary caregivers betray you repeatedly. So when the neural pathways are forming, if you were betrayed enough as a very young child, why would you trust people? Why would you even want to trust people? Alternatively, I also see people who trust too much when they have no good reason to trust someone, like they just met them at a bar and they've known them 30 seconds and telling them their life story and giving them the family china. And that is something I will pay attention to as well. It's kind of the flip side of counter dependency. And I'm going to talk about that more in a future video, because a lot of people who are scapegoated do, I find, tend to overtrust almost as much as this not feeling they can trust at all. There will be, with structural dissociation, at times somatic symptoms, very painful migraines, stomach cramping. Maybe that's been going on for years and years since childhood. Nervous tics, I'll see that sometimes. And alternatively, again, an unusual tolerance to physical pain. And that can be, one is so dissociated from their body that they can have tremendous pain and be able to tolerate it. I know someone whose neck was, for all intents and purposes, broken when it was seen on the X-ray. A fusion from the past had fallen to the side, and that person walked around like that for 2 years. And as the muscles atrophied and there was more and more pain, they were just so dissociated from their body they could function like that. Experiencing partial amnesia, gaps in the recall of events, unable to remember personal information at times, and time gaps that might relate to a couple of the ones that I've read, but gaps in time, which we all can have to some extent. If you've ever gotten in a car and driven somewhere and you honestly don't remember how you got there, you've driven in the route so many times, maybe to work. Next thing you know, you're there and you have no memory really of what route you took and how you got there, but you're there. But this would be happening beyond just kind of that auto memory from having done something so many times. I guess we can call it autopilot. And my client will feel kind of confused about it. Just they will describe it as missing time gaps, chunks of time they don't remember. So I'll pay close attention to that as a clinician during my assessment process. Naturally, if you're relating to a lot of these symptoms, it can feel overwhelming, and that's understandable. But the way I like to explain it to my clients is we all have parts. We all have different voices talking in our head. If we all were to say everything in our head out loud, we'd all look like something wasn't quite right with us to the mental health community. So we all have parts. What makes this structural dissociation is each part can have its own unique personality with its own feelings and thoughts and behaviors. And there's not this overriding sense of an integrated self that's aware of these parts. Oh yeah, I have a part of me that gets really anxious when I go up to perform singing, or I have a part that, has trouble asking for what I want, where you're aware of these different parts. This is where you become that part. And it's almost, I talk to my clients about it feeling almost like you're possessed. This huge energy comes into you. Sometimes it might be a more quiet, subtle energy, and some behaviors might occur, some reactions. And again, there might be this sense of feeling really untethered, ungrounded. There's not this unifying self. This is where I get into more transpersonal territory. As I said, I'll be doing some videos that are more psychospiritually oriented. I used to call this subpersonalities. Now we call it parts, but this is because I was trained in the work of Roberto Assagioli and into psychosynthesis. I was actually working with John Furman and Ann Gila, who wrote a wonderful book, The Primal Wound, on psychosynthesis. And so if you think about these parts as being in an orchestra and each one's playing a different instrument, the unifying self would be the conductor. And that's a goal in treatment when I work with any of my clients, but especially my clients who have complex trauma. Trauma responses, of course, are associated with parts. It can be the case, you can go into a fight response and within a couple minutes going into a submit response. People who shift into different parts quickly can have a high degree of distress because it does feel so chaotic and confusing. And so how do I work with structural dissociation as a trauma-informed clinician? I'm going to do a video about that, as I said, next week, but I'd invite all of you to do a little exercise on your own this week. And because it's what I do with my clients, and the exercise is simply, I call it the just noticing exercise. Don't try to change anything, but just notice. Notice if you feel some emotional distress. Check in and say, how do I feel right now? Does this distress remind me of anything from when I was young? You might journal a bit about it. Again, if you're working with a therapist already, you might bring that journaling into them so you can look at it together. Just noticing your body. Are your hands clenching? Are you feeling a lump in your throat? Is your heart racing. These are the kinds of somatic noticing exercises I'll invite my client to experiment with. And I call everything an experiment in my practice. And again, a reminder, if anything feels upsetting for you, triggering, overwhelming, uncomfortable, then don't try any of these things. And that's why I do have a long disclosure at the beginning of my video, and there's a longer one on my website on the menu with YouTube disclaimer, that it's important to read, because obviously I'm not treating any of you, but certainly these exercises are something that is appropriate for anyone to try, to just notice what's happening inside of you. Notice possible parts. Notice your body and your body's sensations. And again, if something feels uncomfortable, stop. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, including if you try any noticing exercises. And it's my hope that as our community grows, I'll have a more formal community container for people. But right now we are talking there on the community tab and in the comments. And if you like this video, please click the thumbs up and maybe share it with others if you think it would be helpful for them. And a reminder, if you haven't subscribed already, I hope you do. And I will be continuing this clinical series that's targeted for adult survivors of family scapegoating abuse, but these videos are appropriate for clinicians and therapists as well. And I have started a For Clinicians and Therapists playlist. And if you know people in the mental health field who are interested in what I've called family scapegoating abuse, or FSA, invite them to also subscribe to my channel and check out my For Therapists and Clinicians playlist. See you next week.